I was told I should start with my cat. So, here's my cat. Come on, say hi. No, you want to say hi? Not really. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Figure you can look at my cat if he will turn around and look at you until class starts. Come on. Yeah, say hi. You can probably hear him. He squawks. He's a squawker. His name is Captain. He's a fluffy kitty. He doesn't really do the whole, like, stare into the camera thing much, sadly. So you're just kind of seeing his back and his butt. Alright, why don't you go stare at the birds? Go on. Go on. Go on. Alright. Thank you for coming and saying hi to people. Now you can go back to the window and stare at the birds. It's his favorite pastime. The kitty's name is Captain. He is such a floofball. Hopefully everybody can see okay and it's not freezing up too badly. If it does, I am posting the recordings on the Facebook page events. I'm trying to get them posted up to YouTube, but YouTube doesn't seem to like me much. So that's an ongoing struggle. I will post in the Facebook event when I do actually manage to get it up to YouTube. I guess if it freezes a lot really badly, let me know in the stream. I don't think there's anything I can do about it, but it will be helpful to know if this is working well or not. So, hello, welcome, thanks for coming. If you came to the last class, welcome back. If this is your first time, welcome for the first time. So this is the second class in the series. The first class was on preparing the text block. So it got us up to about this point on the book. For those of you who weren't here last time, this is the kind of book we're making. It's an Islamic style, medieval Islamic style method, process. So if you have questions, you can post them in the chat. I have somebody who is keeping an eye on the chat to make sure that I actually answer questions in a timely manner, because my computer's tilted kind of funny so that you can see me or see what I'm doing better. So I can't see the chat window very well. Let's see. I talked about the video from last class. Oh, any questions before we get started? Okay, well, if there are, post them in the chat and I'll answer them. So what we are doing today is sewing the Endband, and we're going to make good use of this thing, so hopefully it works out okay. This is the Endband. It serves a couple of different functions. It helps keep the spine lining attached, even if the glue dries and crumbles, and it provides a little bit of extra structure and support to the text block, and it looks pretty, honestly. Islamic arts tend to be a merger of functionality and prettiness, which is one of the things I like about it. So I'm going to demonstrate how we do the Endband. The most common pattern is chevron, of which I have done my best to mimic. Striped is also a very common pattern, which looks very similar to chevron and is made basically the same way. There are other patterns as well that were used but less commonly, and I haven't learned how to do those yet. I found a really handy 2-video YouTube series of somebody who literally demonstrates how to sew Islamic style endbands, which was very helpful, but he only does the chevron pattern ones. So I figured out the striped ones rather by accident when, well, I screwed up the chevron ones, because that's how it goes. All right, so step 1, take our books. So as you can see, the spine lining is a little bit, well, actually we'll get to this. Step 1 actually is, I take this out of the way so you can see, leather. So the core of the Endband, you can see it on this one that I'm half done with. Hold on just a second, my computer's doing something funny and I need to fix it. So, questions while I work. No, you do not have to use leather. It was the most common one. You can use literally any kind of scrap leather. You need a very tiny little piece of it. Hold on just a minute while I fix whatever the heck is going on here with my computer. Let's see if that fixed it. Sorry about that. Yeah, that should work. Okay. All right. Questions. Did I figure out the pounds of paper I prefer? Yes, I did. So 90 GSM, grams per square meter, I think is what the GSM stands for, is what I usually use for the hemp paper. You can go higher than that, although I would suggest probably not going much higher than about 150 GSM. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the conversion over to pounds for that. Hopefully that answers your question. Basically, if you can fold it easily, it'll work. If you can't fold it easily, it's probably not something you want to use, but you're welcome to give it a try. Let me know how it goes. So leather, back to the Endband. So leather was the most common Endband core. You could also use rolled paper or parchment. If you don't know what parchment is, it's basically paper but made from animal skins. And if you want to know more than that, I recommend Googling it, because I honestly don't know. I don't work with parchment. Let's see. Is that all of my questions, I think? You can use any kind of leather. So this is some random scrap, like was probably on furniture at one point before I bought it. Leather that I happen to have lying around. You can get like leather cording from most craft stores. The leather cording that I found tends to be a little bit thick, but if you've got a sharp knife and are careful about it, you can kind of cut it in half and use it that way. But really, you're going to cut a very small little piece. So talk to any leather worker. I'm sure they would be happy to give you tiny little scraps, because you're looking for a little bit longer than the width of the spine by maybe an 1/8 of an inch. So you don't need anything super amazing. So I basically just cut a little thin strip. I don't bother to measure, but you can if it makes you feel better. I just kind of eyeball a thin strip. The smaller the book, generally the thinner the strip, because I don't want it taking over the entire thing. But I mean, if you really want to augment, like make it super decorative and awesome, then you could make a wider one. It's going to take you longer to sew it. Sewing the endband is one of the longest parts of the book, other than waiting for the glue to dry. So, a general note when working with tools that cut leather: skin is leather. If your tool will cut leather, it will cut you too. So be careful. That's pretty much the only lesson I've ever learned from a leather worker, is be careful when cutting leather. I'd like to learn more lessons, and I will contact people. All right, so bringing this back down, and we're gonna see how well my tiny little magnifying glass works, because it's kind of small, so hopefully this will work okay. All right, so where this goes is just kind of on top here. Now you can see that I cut my spine lining a little bit too long, and it's sitting up past, if this would stay in place. Remember how I mentioned I need like 4 hands? This is another time when I need like 4 hands. Okay, so spine lining is taller than the leather core. That's not really preferable. What will happen is when you're sewing the primary end band, this linen spine lining will fold over the top, and it makes it more difficult to weave the secondary end band. So there's a really simple fix for this. It's a pair of scissors. And again, I kind of eyeball it. I've been doing this long enough that I've got a decent idea of how thick my leather is that I use. So you want it close to the same, so the kind of the depth or height of the leather strip is about the height above the text block that you want your spine lining to extend. Just barely under that. All right, come on. I really need to sharpen my scissors. Bad seamstress who doesn't sharpen her scissors. All right. Okay, so as you can see, it's a little better now. All right, just a second. Pollen is really bad today. Okay, all right, so questions so far. We're getting to the more difficult part. All right, hopefully that stays reasonably well. All right. So for the thread, I usually use the same color thread that I use to sew the binding. In this particular case, I used white, and white does not show up very well in white, so we're not doing that. I'm going to use red, because red shows up really well. So, make it easier for y'all to follow along. So for this one, you only need a single width thread. Although if you're using, so I looked up the silk weights too. So the Gutermann silk that you can get from like Joann's or other kind of major craft stores is a 30 weight, and it's a little bit thin. This silk that I'm using now is a 60 weight, and it's just about perfect. So if you're using the 30 weight, you may want to double it up, but the 60 weight is you can just use one. So tie a knot, whatever your preferred method. You want a knot that's big enough that it won't get pulled through the weave of the linen you're using. So if you're using coarser weave linen, you're going to need a bigger knot. Or you're just going to have to like stitch a few stitches into the spine lining to anchor your thread, which is an option. Okay, so let's see. So I tend to start my knots on the outside because that's just kind of my personal preference. Otherwise you get a small little bulge along one of the inside edges, which I don't like, so I don't do that. But you can do whatever your preference is. I haven't found any research that indicates what the correct way to do it is. So I start from the outside. I don't know, it's maybe what, like half an inch down, roughly. You start on one side or the other, just kind of poke it through. And then back to the outside. Because you actually need it on the outside, but I find it's kind of helpful just to help anchor it a little bit, to have one stitch there. As you can see, this one's kind of pulling away. I didn't have quite enough glue at the end when I glued the spine lining, which is one of the reasons that the Endband is used, is to help keep the spine lining attached even if the glue fails. So it's fine. It's not a problem. So I actually do the first stitch without the leather there because trying to hold the leather in place without something to anchor it doesn't work super well. All right, I'm gonna see how well I can do this to show you guys. Here, let's tilt this camera over this way so you can see better. So you just kind of stab it back out. So I went over the top this time. Come here. Making a loop. And then when the loop is small enough to be manageable, put the leather in. Usually I work with slightly smaller pieces of leather that don't extend quite as far off each side, but today I didn't bother trimming it down before I started. And then you pull mostly tight. Not completely tight, especially this one because the spine lining is not holding it in place as well. A couple stitches in, I'll tighten them up. Okay. And then all this making some amount of sense so far, I hope. All right. So this first stitch I did into the margin or the outside. I find that that's helpful for preventing the Endband from like squinching in on the ends. So it helps make sure that it actually goes the full width of the text block. All right, and then most of the stitches are going to be through the middle of a gathering. So you find the center of a gathering and you stab through, that's probably like what, a quarter of an inch? 3/8, something like that. No, an eighth to somewhere between an eighth and a quarter, roughly. And you gently stab through paper and lining. And if the lining's not glued down, well, you kind of have to hold it in place while you do this. There you go. Okay. Are there questions in the chat that I'm not seeing? That would be unfortunate. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat that I haven't answered. So if there's a question that's supposed to be in the chat that has not been answered, my moderator, can you please message me the question? Okay. We go back out. And this one's just decided it's going to be difficult because the spine lining's not glued all the way, but we'll manage. All right, and see I've tightened my stitches a little bit more. So then you go to the next center. So one of the, if it's going through the middle of the binding, would it be helpful? You can do that. So the reason I don't do that is that my awl is thicker than my needle by a not insignificant amount. So if I punch it with the awl, then I will be punching a larger hole than necessary. And I prefer not to do that with this step. But you can, if it makes it easier. If you're having trouble getting the needle to go through, then in the future, definitely just punch it with the awl. But I find for the most part, it works okay with the needle. It also kind of depends on the paper you're using. This is a finer weave paper than I usually use, so it's actually slightly harder than the normal art paper. So one of the plus sides of leaving your paper folded as opposed to cutting it and then folding it is that it's really, really easy to find the center of the gatherings. Like, super dead simple. Some of the thicker art papers, it's also usually very easy to find the center of the gatherings. If you look at the other side of this book, it's a lot more difficult to figure out where the center of the gatherings is just by looking at it. So that is a plus side for leaving the pages uncut until the end. The downside is cutting the pages at the end tends to leave a rough, kind of raggedy edge, which I generally don't prefer, but some people like that in their books. So stab it through the next one. So the thing that I'm doing over here is this loop that you're making when you stab through, make sure your needle goes through the center of it. It helps anchor that stitch to the stitch before it a little bit better. So as you're working, you should see that the stitches kind of have a line running along the bottom from where they've connected to each other. So one way that I've seen that's helpful if you're having trouble finding the center of your gatherings, because for instance you cut the paper to begin with, is you can use markers for that. So you'll go through ahead of time and you'll locate the center of the gathering and you'll place a little marker, and then you'll locate the center of the next gathering and then you'll place a little marker, so that when it's time to go to that one, you just find the next marker and open the book to that spot. It helps. And you could just use random scrap pieces of paper or whatever you got lying around that's reasonably thin. So I'm going to do this a few more times. Hopefully it makes some amount of sense. This part's kind of the easy part. It's weaving the secondary end band that's a little bit more challenging. And you don't have to be too super persnickety about making sure that they're all kind of the same length down. Like, I don't bother measuring it, I just kind of eyeball it, and sometimes it's a little bit more crooked. I don't know how you can see that, but it's kind of crooked, like a buttonhole stitch. Yeah, I think this is a buttonhole stitch. Honestly, I don't remember the names of my stitches very well, I just sew them. I'm bad at that. I don't know if this stitch has a specific name. It's probably like a buttonhole or a blanket stitch. I'd have to check what those stitches look like specifically to figure it out. And then you just keep doing this. You do the center of each gathering. Hopefully you guys can sometimes see what I'm doing reasonably okay. This is one of the harder ones to really demonstrate via camera. If you checked my blog, you'll see I have a number of photos attempting to like capture all of the different pieces of this, and it still probably wasn't enough. So now we're at the end, we're at the other side. So we're going to stitch through on this side again because it makes a good anchor. One of the things that's helpful is to have kind of an even number of stitches, because when you get to the secondary end band that helps with the weaving, but it'll work just fine with any number. Couldn't see the spine. Hold on. Like that. Is that what you wanted to see? can see there's just a line of stitches connecting all of them along the bottom here. And some of them, like that one's super not aligned with the rest of them, but that's fine. Now there's that one. So it doesn't really matter that much. No one's going to see it once you glue the cover on. Unless the book falls apart, which, you know, a few hundred years from now it'll do. Depending on how rough you are with it. So when you get to the end, let's see if I can figure out how to show you this. Just kind of tie a little knot, grab a little bit of the spine lining fabric, tie a tiny knot around the end of the last stitch. And then I tend to double tie it just for security. Like I said, you're going to glue over top of this, so it shouldn't really come apart. And you're also going to weave over top of this, so even if it comes apart, it's not really going to do much. But so then you've just got, I don't know how you can see, there's a tiny little knot there. And then I bury the end of my thread on the inside because I'm a quilter, and I learned to do that. So basically just bring your thread to the inside of the book and then cut it as close as you can without cutting anything that you don't want to cut, like the stitch previous. Come on. Okay. You can see I cut way longer than I needed for the thread, but that's fine. I'd rather have excess that I didn't use and then not have enough and have to tie in a new piece partway through. So when you're done with the primary end band, this is what it's going to look like. And nominally, these are all kind of evenly spaced in the middle of their gathering, but functionally they tend not to be. That's okay, you're going to move them around when you weave the secondary end band anyway. So it's not too big a deal. All right, next step is going to be even more fun. So I find it helpful for weaving the secondary end band to prop the book up in between something. All right, let's hope we can see that well enough. All right, questions up to this point? Okay, so to make the difference extremely very clear between the different threads that we're going to be working with, I'm going to use two different colors. Normally I would use the same color that I used for this plus an additional color, but I'm going to do two totally separate colors just so you can see everything. Alright, so for an amount of thread, you need a bit on the end to tie a knot, and then I find you usually wind up with like 6 to 12 rows, kind of depends on the width or the thickness of your thread, the width of your core, how tightly packed you manage to get the individual lines of weaving, whatever. So measure it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, measure generously, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then, because like I said, I really hate to run out of thread partway through, I do an extra like 4 inches. It's way more than I need. You also don't want like a super, super long piece of thread to start because then it just kind of goes everywhere and gets in your way. So, I don't know how well you can see it, but it's probably, let's see, how many inches long is this? I cut one about 16 inches long. It's probably about 5 inches too long, but whatever. It'll work. And then, get a second color. Technically you could do these with the same color, but then you wouldn't really get the pretty pattern, so up to you, but I suggest using 2 colors. The downside is you have to buy 2 different colors of silk thread. The upside is you get to do pretty patterns, and you can alternate, you know, do one book with one color as the binding, and another book with the other color as the binding, and just have fun. So, cut another separate color, same length, so I'm doing white and blue. Hopefully the white will show up okay. Thread them together onto your needle. And tie a knot at the other end. whatever your favorite method for making a knot is. Again, this one needs to be big enough that it doesn't pull through your spine lining. So that's a reason that I use a fairly fine weave linen as opposed to, say, the super that they sell for bookmaking. I think I showed it last time, but I can show it again. So this stuff exists, and you can buy it. It's generally used for book repair. It is a very, very loose weave, so I don't really recommend it for this kind of bookmaking. Mostly because of having to tie the knots for the end bands. You basically have to tie a knot around the threads on that weave for that to work, because otherwise you'd have a giant knot. Alright, that should be big enough. Okay, now comes the super fun part. Attempting to do this so that you guys can see means I have to use the computer screen to try and show me what I'm doing. It's gonna be great. Alright, so this one again starts on the outside. I tend to put it pretty close to the other knot because you're gonna have a slight bump there anyway, so you may as well keep the bumps together and just make it look like one big bump. Alright, and then same thing we did before, stab it back out. You're just gonna kind of help anchor it so that even if the knot somehow comes out or undone, you have some amount of friction tension holding it in place. And then up close, so on the in between the first two stitches, near the top of the spine lining, yeah, stab it back out and through. And then you're going to pick one of your two threads and you're going to take it off your needle. Only one, the other one stays on. So I'm taking the white off and I'm keeping the blue on. And then I'm untangling the two because that's going to be important. Alright, we're going to set this aside for just a second. So, if you watched the YouTube videos that I put in the class notes, you will notice that the guy did basically samplers for the first one. It's just take a piece of cardboard, cut a miniature loom, thread it with some embroidery floss, and then practice. So my first attempt looks a lot more like stripes than chevrons. My second attempt, I did a lot better at the whole chevron shape thing. This is really helpful. The first time I tried doing this, I tried doing it without practicing first, and it didn't. I got stripes all. And then I got like 2 rows of chevrons, and then I got stripes again. So it was completely inconsistent. I recommend practicing. Seriously, it's a piece of random scrap bit of cardboard and some random embroidery floss I had lying around. And honestly, the embroidery floss part is just to help make it easier to see because it's bigger. But this is very helpful. So, what I'm going to show you is the same thing except done on the book itself. Alright, this is going to be entertaining and fun. Let's see if I can... Yeah, we're going to start with the book facing this direction so you can see. Maybe you can see. Maybe we can make this so you can see. Come on. No, you need to be closer. Closer to the camera. Alright. Is that reasonably in focus, visible, clear, I hope? Probably the best I can do, so hopefully it'll work. Alright, so I've got my 2 separate threads, white and blue. My blue is my working thread, my white is just sort of a tag along. So, you start. I generally do groups of 2 stitches. If it's a particularly wide book, you could do groups of like 3 instead. The more stitches you do, the bigger each of your stitches kind of comes out, if that makes sense. So this is this one. This is on 2 stitches or 2 threads. So the bigger you do, but I find 2 to be particularly useful. So you go through from the outside of the book towards the inside of the book through the first 2 stitches with your needle. And you make sure it doesn't loop over the end of the endband core. There we go. And then you go underneath your tag along thread, and you go under the next set of 2 stitches from the outside to the inside. So I haven't necessarily been able to like consistently do very clear chevrons versus very clear stripes, so I'm not entirely positive, but I'm pretty sure the difference between them is the direction that you take the stitch, the direction you wrap, basically. I am not catching the spine lining. Nope. Just going around it. So you go under the white tag along thread, and you go under the next 2 stitches. Like that. And then you pull it kind of tight. Not super tight, because you don't want this to, the tighter you pull it, the easier it is. You're going to drag the ends in, and you don't want to do that. And then you go under your tag along thread. So you can call this sewing, you can call it weaving. Really, honestly, it's a little of both. You're kind of sewing in a weaving pattern. And then eventually you just kind of get to the point where you go under the thread at the same time you go through the other threads, which is what I just did there, rather than doing them as separate motions. And you just kind of push them down so that they stay where they're supposed to be. And then you go under the next 2. And then if you had an odd number of gatherings and subsequently an odd number of stitches, you would then go under 3 for this last one. Or anywhere you want, just as long as you remember where it was. Which is why it's helpful to just do it on the last one, because then you remember. Alright, and then the end can get a tiny bit tricky. I've had some problems here. So you go under again with the white one. Yeah, you can see. And then you go from the opposite direction, but still from the outside to the inside of the book, back through the stitches you just went through. And you make sure that the loop that forms catches the tag-along thread in the middle of it. If you don't do that, you're just going to pull out the stitch you just made and you have to redo it. And you want to make sure that the previous line is tight before you pull this one tight. Otherwise, you're going to get some slightly odd bumps, which is fine. But and then you just sort of shove it all the way over and down. And that's your first row. And then you take your tag-along thread and you flip it over to the other side. And you go under it again. And then you go back through the next set of 2 stitches. Like that. And you pull it reasonably tight, but not super tight, because let's see how well you can see this. If I pull it really tight, see how it's dragging this end in? We don't really want to do that, because that'll end up with a funny, scrunched up looking secondary endband that only covers like most of the text block, which is not the best. Doesn't look quite as pretty. Alright, and then we scrunch it down. And then we go under again. And then we go through and under in one motion. Hopefully that you can kind of see that. So through and under. Again, you can do them as separate motions, especially at the beginning if it makes you feel more comfortable, but that takes more time, and eventually you'll get comfortable and you can do them all kind of in one swoop. And then the next 2. And yeah, I went under. Is this making sense? Can you see reasonably okay? It's a little bit difficult. I will, once we're off of the front side of the book, I will switch it around so it's closer to the camera so you can see a little better, but unfortunately that doesn't work while I'm working inside. So the goal here is to cover pretty much the entire endband core. So the first couple of rows that you do are going to be covering the thickness of the core. So the thinner the core, the less of kind of a hump you wind up with at the end, more of like a flat, straight thing. Bookbinder's leather is generally thinner even than this little random, the thinnest piece I could find of random upholstery leather. So they would have just used whatever tiny little scraps they had. So we're going to be working with thicker leather, unless you get bookbinding leather, which is sadly expensive, because I really, really want to learn to play with that stuff. It's going to be thicker than it would have been if made by, you know, an artisan a few hundred years ago. But we work with what we got. So, and then again, I'm at the end, so I went back through the other direction, made sure to catch the tag-along thread in the middle of the loop as I tighten it. And then I forgot to tighten that stitch, so there we go. Tight, tight, there we go. And then we flip the tag-along thread back over. Alright, and I'm going to do this one a little bit more quickly because then we will be at the point where I think I can flip the book around and you can see better. So even at like full speed for me, this takes almost 30 to 40 minutes to do. Depending on the size of the book and how cooperative the threads are being that day. Because some days they just like to snarl and decide not to get caught at the end of each row and all of that fun stuff. But some days, like today, they're being nice, which is good. And then every few rows, just sort of shove my needle in there and kind of shove the stitches back down a little bit, just because my nail doesn't always do it. All right, let's flip this around so you can hopefully see a little better. Maybe, okay. So I'm going from the outside of the book to the inside of the book. I have caught my tag-along thread in the middle of my working thread, and then I flip it over. So I am underneath my tag-along thread. I go through the next two, and you'll find as you work that after the first like row or so, the stitches from the primary end band, the tie downs, are clumped together to make it easier for you to remember how many stitches you did. Come on. It has a tendency to just sort of catch itself on the edge of the spine lining, but oh well. And you pull it just a little bit tight, but not too tight. And then you go under. And then you go to the next set. That. It's hard to tell if this is even in focus, but hopefully you can see okay. And then you go under. And ideally, when you're done with this, you won't even know what color the tie-down threads are because they'll be completely covered. Except for like out here. But when you're completely done with the book, you will have no idea what color the tie-down threads are because they're totally covered. In practice, that doesn't always happen, but you know, that's the goal. So, like that. Like that. So, some common things that I at least have managed to screw up while I do it is not going the same direction each time, so I might accidentally like go from the inside out, which twists the threads a different way and is probably what causes the striped patterns. I haven't actually done, scientific research of making sure that that's really what it is. Another common one is at the end here, if you forget to go under the tag-along thread and go back through the stitches, you wind up with a loop that doesn't capture your tag-along thread. So if I were to continue pulling, see, these two are not connected in any way. If I were to continue pulling, I would just undo the previous stitch that I did. There's a simple way to fix this though. So I've occasionally caught it like here before, which is always fun. So you just make it a little bit bigger, big enough that you can stick 2 fingers through, grab your tag-along thread, and pull it through. And then you can pull this again. Oh, I gotta retighten that row. Another common kind of pitfall is forgetting to tighten the threads as you go, so you end up with like loops, which is not the worst thing, but it does look a little funny. Forgetting to wrap around as you go here basically just leaves you with a weird looking stitch where the tag-along thread is like twice as long as it should be before you catch it again. Lost the thread. That's another one. If you keep a long enough tail on your thread, you shouldn't lose the needle, but I wasn't paying attention and my tail shortened. So let me rethread the needle. Like I said, there are other patterns, I just haven't learned how to weave them yet. It's a project for someday. Alright, so as you can see, this takes forever. And you have to do this on the head and the tail of the book. So in modern books, they've pretty much stopped doing these end bands. They'll put like a decorative one on the outside that just sort of helps protect the very top inside edge of the text block. But it's predominantly decorative. It doesn't lend much to the structure of the text block. I think Europeans did the end bands too, at least for part of their bookbinding history, but I'm not very familiar with European bookbinding. I was only recently able to find some good resources on it and haven't had the time to read them yet fully. Alright, so at the end of this row, I'm going to stop this side and flip to the other side and show you how to finish off, because otherwise we'll be here for a while longer. Because we're going to do one more step tonight to prepare us for the next class. Alright, so yeah, that's actually doing a pretty good chevron pattern this time. Sometimes it still kind of ends up looking stripy to me, but this one seems to be doing pretty decent on the chevrons. If I were to use a thicker thread or double up this thread, I think the chevrons would be even more obvious, but I don't know. I like this. I like having them a little bit more subtle. All right, so flipping around to the other side. You can see I'm almost finished. I basically have one last row to do. So I prefer to end mine on the opposite side of where I started it so that I can spread the knots out a little bit. I don't have, 3 knots right there. I have 2 and then 1 on the other side. Another thing that you might notice is that these 2 threads, one red, one white, are now different lengths. They were the same length when I started. So, for some strange reason, the 2 don't get pulled quite evenly. I don't know why. Alright, rethread the needle. Alright, so we're at the end here. So I generally start as flush as you can get it to the text block, go all the way over the hump, and then right about where it starts to go back into the thickness of, so when you're done across the top and you're about to go over the edge, that's about where I stop. Again, I will sometimes go a little bit further in order to make sure I end with a knot on the other side, but it's up to you. The goal here is to completely cover the end band core to help protect it from the elements, basically. A lot of bookbinding is protecting the text block and then protecting the things that protect the text block. It's a layered defense. Very strategic. All right. For that one, trying to work backwards is an extra special challenge because I usually just flip the book back and forth so that I'm always working forward. But not this time, because the goal here is to show you guys not do it perfectly. And whoever I give the book away to probably won't even know, so it's fine. When you get to this stage, it can be a little bit hard sometimes to grab the primary tie-down threads. Yeah, sadly this is white, so you can't see them very well. But what you can do is you can go further down closer to where they came up through the gatherings in the spine lining to catch them, and then just pull your thread, back up as you work so that it's, you know, up top here where it needs to be, not further down where it doesn't need to be. Come here. Sorry, I have to do this. Here, let's see. Can you see in this camera? No, I don't think this camera's got very good visibility on it either. But I'm catching them lower down in the spine lining. Or along the spine lining, and then, see, I caught it lower down and then I'm pulling it back up. And then you wrap around. See, I'm catching it all the way down here and then pulling it back up. Hopefully that's making sense. Alright, and this is the last one. Whoops. Bumping things around all over the place. So, come on, over there. Alright, so after this, you're going to re-thread the other thread back onto the needle. Preferably going the same direction, but I mean, whatever floats your goat. Okay, so got both threads back on the needle. And I'm going to do the same thing I did for the primary endband tie down at the end. I'm basically just going to take the two of them, stitch it through a little, catch a little piece of the spine lining, and tie a knot. And try not to catch it around the other knots. Try not to come on. That's another, you know, potential pitfall is you can snag the other knots, which is why we help re-anchor them into the... Alright, hold on. I'm going to have to shorten the tail on the red one because it is way longer than the tail on the white one. It's causing me problems. Okay. And then again, I do that like twice just to make sure it anchors it. We're going to be gluing it to the cover, so it really just needs to survive until you glue it, but it's helpful if it, you know, survives longer than that, just in case. And then again, I poke them through. I don't think it really makes that much of a difference, but it's the quilter in me. Bury the ends. Trim it close. Ta-da! The end band. And I did a pretty decent job of making sure that it's the full, it covers the full width of the text block. Looks like it curled in just a little bit on this side, which is not the best, but happens anyway. So, when you're done sewing the end band, you are going to move all of this stuff out of my way and dig my X-Acto knife back out. Generally don't do what I do and just leave needles places, but put them back away. But I'll do that after class. Do what I say, not what I do. You know, that whole thing. All right, so you've got these ends sticking out of the Endband core that are not very useful. In the older books, sometimes what they do is they would just curl them down and glue them in. But with the thicker leather that I'm using, that doesn't really work. So I don't know if you can really see it, but there's like a lighter top section of the leather and then a darker bottom section. The leather that I've seen for bookbinding is about as thick as the upper section all by itself. So half the thickness of this one. And that's almost like just leathery cloth at that point. So that would be easy enough to fold down and hide in, but this is thicker, so I just trim it off. Thank you. It's taken me like a dozen books, so 24 Endbands to get this good. So don't worry if it doesn't look quite that good when you do it. You'll get there. It just takes a lot of practice. Seriously, do the little practice things. They're super easy. Use whatever random string, thread, yarn you've got in your house, and some cardboard. So what I'm doing down here, let's see if you can. Handy dandy. I like this magnifying glass thingy. I've never used it that much before, but I'm using it now. Getting my money's worth out of it. Let's see, is this gonna work? Nope, no it's not. All right, whatever. Hopefully you can see reasonably well. If not, you can imagine it. I am trimming the ends of the Endband core as close to flush with the text block as I can without cutting anything that I shouldn't be cutting, like the threads of the Endband. Get these out of the way. Normally I don't do this until both sides are completed, so that way I don't risk like accidentally cutting the threads from the other side. No, Captain. No, sweetie. You can say hi to them in a little while when I'm done. I'm sorry, my love. You can come back later. Now that I've let him on my workspace, he wants to come back on my workspace. So, trimming as close as possible, just a sharp X-Acto knife works great. Press down. So, let's bring the magnifier over again. So you can see it's cut basically flush. It's pretty close to flush. It doesn't matter if it's just a little bit off. No one's really going to care. Unless you're a perfectionist, in which case you are welcome to try and get it flush the best you can. I'm not a perfectionist. I am a big proponent of good enough. So, the next step is to attach the cover boards. Technically, this can be done later after you've attached or as you attach the cover, but I find it's really helpful to attach the cover if I'm working with a fairly continuous attached thing. So this is the step we're going to take it to now. Basically, the extra bit from the spine lining gets glued to the inside of the cover boards. There are instances in the research where it's glued to the outside. I honestly haven't been able to figure out a good reason for that. It works a little more effectively as a hinge if you've got this cloth hinge on the inside and then a cloth or leather hinge on the outside for the cover. But, you know, if you really want to put it on the outside, that's fine. The downside of having it on the inside is that you do get this little bump here. You can clearly see where it is. With thicker papers, it doesn't happen as much. It's a little bit harder to tell, but printer paper is very thin. And with leather, it's probably even harder to tell. But again, I haven't worked with leather. So this here is called the doublure or the end sheet. If you look it up online, European bookbinding tradition will tell you that it's only called a doublure when it's leather. But the my favorite book, I didn't show you guys the references this time, I did last time. My favorite book, which literally walks you through pretty much how to do it and shows you examples of books where they did it, calls them all doublures, so that's what I do. My other favorite book, this one, actually has translations from an 11th century manual and a manual from 1619 for bookbinders. So that's where I get the steps for how to do this. It's kind of confusing, so if you don't know anything about bookbinding, don't start with this book. Just trust me on that. Don't. Like, for instance, they don't describe the spine lining in the 11th century one. They describe some sort of paper that seems to serve a similar function, but the description of how you apply it is really kind of weird. So start with learning how to do the steps, and then you can go delve into the really, really old explanation, translated explanations of how in the world you're supposed to, what you're trying to do. All right, so we're going to glue these on now, because like I said, it's easier. You can do what you want, really, but try it both ways. You'll probably come around to my way of thinking. So to get to the cover boards, you can use, so for a book this small and made of printer paper, mat board, like you would buy to cut mats for like paintings or photographs or whatever, works great. That's what I'm using. For larger books or like heavier paper books, you can also get binder's board. I don't know how you can read that. It's thicker. So let's see if we can do a side-by-side comparison for the camera. So I've got the thinnest binder's board you can get, realistically. I don't know if you can see this super well, but it's like twice or 3 times as thick as a mat board. It is very thick, very stiff, works great, but it's also very thick. So for a small book like this, you don't need anything that thick. So to measure, basically there's a couple ways. You can just kind of put the book block on, I trace it in pencil and then cut it. Or in my case, since I'm making a whole bunch this size, I measured it and then cut strips and then cut strips again. Work great. So for instance, here's one of my strips. So I cut them to size, and then I just cut out a strip per the width. If you do it that way for this specific size mat board and book size, you end up with a random little extra bit, which works great as the 4-edge flap. So you can cut 2 4-edge flaps per each of these. So that's helpful. And then I've got another strip, so this one's actually the strip where I'm cutting the envelope flaps out. So I've got one traced in that I haven't cut out yet. But we'll get to that next class. So, attaching the cover boards, you're going to need your glue. Showed you guys this last time, I use wheat starch glue because it is the period technique, or it's one of several period techniques, but it's one I can find modernly that's still used. There's also PVA glue, which I have somewhere else in the house at the moment because I'm using it to make covers. That's polyvinyl acetate. The specific one I have is pH neutral, acid-free, archival, specifically for bookbinding, but like Elmer's glue is PVA. I wouldn't necessarily recommend using Elmer's glue. Oh, yeah, that'd be cool. 8th ply from the craft stores, cool. That would probably work too. I haven't tried it. But that could probably work. Anyway, glue, right. So you could probably use like Elmer's glue or craft glue or something like that. The downside of those is they tend not to be acid-free, pH neutral, so they will over time degrade more quickly than the archival stuff. The archival stuff could last centuries. Elmer's glue will probably maybe last like a decade or so. So, my wheat starch glue, vegetable glue from xanthan gum and rice flour. Yes, I think there's a recipe in the Book of Chemistry that includes rice flour. I haven't tried it, but yeah, that'd be cool. So anyway, glue. So parchment paper is great for making sure the glue doesn't stick to anything it shouldn't stick to. So I take a piece of parchment paper, fold it so I have a nice, clean, crisp edge, and tuck it inside the book, right up where the text block joins the spine lining. sort of leave it there. Take a glop of my glue. Again, finger painting here. It's great. Pretend that you're a little kid again. And just glop it down and smear it on. So for the front side, I actually need that little piece of board back. So the way that these books work is they have an envelope flap that folds inside the front cover. So when you're gluing your front cover on, you want to make sure that you leave a gap so that it's not like jutting up like this. Well, I mean, this is exaggerated, but jutting up because of the extra width. So you want to account for that when you figure out the hinge point. Ah, we've got people who actually know what they're doing. That's awesome. Yeah, so making book cloth, we're going to hopefully cover in the next class, and if not, I'm going to do a bonus mini class on it because I love being able to turn any piece of cool looking cotton into a book cover. Even though that's not the period technique. Might be for like Japan. I haven't researched that yet. So we just sort of glob it on, smear it around. Yes, I know I lost the glob again. It's okay if it comes over a little bit and gets on your parchment paper. Although, since it's doing that, I'm going to swap this out for a clean piece of parchment paper before I put the book in the press. Because I don't want the parchment paper to glue itself, or attempt to glue itself to the cover. It shouldn't because it's parchment paper, but if you got enough glue, it just might. Plus I have some extra pieces, so it's okay. Where's the other little one? There's the other little one. Come here. Yeah, work. So, like I said, so for the front board, I'm wrapping another piece of, just a scrap piece of the board in the parchment paper. Whoops, I got some on the text block. To make sure that when I put the cover on, it is offset enough that it won't interfere with the envelope flap when I put the envelope flap in. All right, so there's my cover boards. So I just sort of kind of line it up where it goes over here and then fold it over and make sure it lines up in front. But you can also just sort of plop it down, whatever works for you. Experiment a little. It's okay if you screw up at first. It's the best way to learn. All right, so it's attached. And it's kind of sticking up a little bit here, but that's fine. It's going in the press, which will hold it down while it dries. So next one, and I'm going to put that same piece of parchment paper I already smeared glue all over back in there, so that this time when I smear glue all over it, I don't have to swap. I can just grab this other piece I got. Alright, so it's much easier to just have a scrap piece of parchment paper to catch all the extra glue, because I don't have to be super careful about it. I like this plan. I'm going to do this in the future. Alright. While I'm doing this, any questions? Sorry we're going a little bit long. Like I said, sewing that Endband takes forever. Which is probably the reason I haven't made more of these books yet, because it's the only really long part. You can see my glue is starting to get a little bit watery. It's getting to the end of its usable life. I need to use this batch up and make a new batch. Alright, there we go. Here's a handy paper towel. That did not rip cleanly. Clean my fingers off. Swap this out for a clean piece. This time I'm just going to kind of drop it down on top. So like I said, you can do whatever really floats your boat. conceal this, get it out of the way. And our favoritist little tiny book press is making an appearance again. So, let's see. Yes, it is open wide enough. Usually open it a little bit wider to help get the book in better, but I only have so many hands. So, and I can't brace it on my lap the way I normally would. So just kind of wedge it in there, make sure that the covers, as best you can, make sure that the covers are lined up, because however you got them in there is however they're going to dry. There we go. Now you can see it again. So yeah, they look lined up. All right. So slide that back in here, make sure that the covers are being compressed by the wood, and tighten it up. So in the manuals, it basically says that they would brace this in between their legs while they tightened the ropes that were what they used instead of handy-dandy threaded rods and wing nuts. But I can't do that and kind of show you at the same time, so. You want it nice and good and tight. Nice and good and tight. And then you just set it aside, let it dry. So we talked about how long it takes the glue to dry last time. I didn't really check. I just kind of leave them overnight, or if I start them in the morning, I leave them till the afternoon, so several hours. But it can take longer or shorter depending on climate wherever you are at the time. Yep, that was what I wanted to cover today. So, questions on any of that? And then I store my silk thread inside its little plastic sleeves to help it prevent it from picking up like lint and cat hair, which is everywhere. See, there's cat hair. All right, so the next class is Saturday at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern. We'll be going over finishing the book. So we're going to take it from this stage, and we're going to attach the cover. And then we're going to cut and attach the foredge flap and the envelope flap. And then we're going to trim the cover, cut the corners, and then we're going to fold the cover over. The list of books I recommend for this is, if you found my blog under the class notes on Facebook, the list is on there. If you have not found my blog, I'll give you my email and the blog in a second, and you can contact me. Where I get my silk thread, I buy it on Etsy. If you want the specific shop, email me. I posted that I get it on Etsy on my blog. So I added to the end of one of my blog posts where I find some of the harder to find, not ingredients is cooking, supplies. And then the last step, of course, is attaching the doublures or end pages or whatever you want to call them. I'm just going to be doing plain white ones, but I will try and show you a sampling of like decorative pretty papers that I found at a store near me recently. I was very excited. So let's see. Is that the questions? That's questions. Yeah. Okay. Right. So I will add it to the chat this time. I won't make my my poor sad little moderator do it for me. So I'm adding to the chat my email. Nope, I spelled that wrong. Sorry. That's the correct spelling. And then it's the thing and then WordPress. Okay. This computer is great, but the keyboard is not the most optimal. That's not correct. I didn't type the right thing. And that's my blog. If you have any questions, you can find me and reach me at either of those. Yeah, and the blog's got more information. It's got a post that is basically the three series, the three classes in this series, except in Word format with lots of pictures. Oh, there is a story behind the name for my blog. It's actually the first blog post, but it's yet another saucy cook. So I started out in the Society for Creative Anachronism. I mentioned that last time, the SCA. If you're not familiar with it and would like to hear more about it, I'll put you in touch with somebody who can explain it to you better than I can. But it's a medieval recreation group. I started out, I kind of got into cooking, and that led me down the arts and sciences rabbit hole. I do all kinds of ANS stuff. I do illumination, but not calligraphy, embroidery, sewing. I recently got into bookbinding, so I figured, I would teach other people because it's actually really cool and way easier than you might think. So hopefully that's you've noticed that it's easy. Hopefully it seemed easy. It seemed easy to me, but hopefully it seemed easy to you as well. So, like I said, let me know if you've got questions. I'm happy to answer them. If you're interested in doing a sort of follow-along style workshop, let me know. I'm looking at putting one of those together. I put together a supplies list today while I was adding links to places where you can get some of the more period supplies. Thank you. I'm glad that it's easy to understand. I know I've had many teachers in college who were not easy, so I'm glad that I'm reasonably easy to understand. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for staying a little bit late. Hopefully the next class will end on time. Like I said, if I don't have time to cover making the covers, pun not intended, then I will do a special mini bonus class for that. So that's it, unless anybody else has questions. And I hope to see you next class. And I will get the recording for this probably tomorrow up on Facebook, and then up on YouTube whenever YouTube decides it doesn't hate me. I don't know why. It won't upload the video. It keeps getting to like 5% and then resetting to 0 and then going up to 5 and then resetting to 0 and in an endless loop. Okay, I'll hang out for a couple more minutes just in case anyone's got any by the way questions, but so yeah, shoot me an email if you're interested in a workshop class, and I will send you the supplies list. And if you're not sure you can source the supplies, I can also ship you a care package for, a few bucks in shipping. Because I have lots of supplies. I had to buy them in bulk to get them, so it makes more sense that way. I think my kitty's gonna make a reappearance. Yep, here he comes. Hi, Captain. You're so fluffy. Yes, you're very cute. Yes, I know. I made you get down from my workspace. Kitty butt. Anybody who owns a cat knows kitty butt. And thank you all for coming. All right, Captain. Need to be able to get to the computer. Need to be able to get to the computer. Stop stream. Bye.